Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the October lecture in the Society of Army Historical Research ongoing series of monthly talks. I know that many of you are familiar now with the platform that we use, which is Demio, but there's always one or two who are new, and therefore I always take a few minutes at the start of each lecture to familiarize you with the platform and to remind you that everybody that has registered for this event will automatically get a copy of the recording sent to them sometime this evening and certainly by first thing tomorrow morning. And we've had a very good sign up this evening, but I also know that a number of people sign up knowing that they can't be here for the live session, but wanting to be assured of getting a copy of the recording. And so for those people who are attending live this evening, please don't get annoyed with me when I put the questions up at the end and then I read them out. And that's simply because those that are watching on the recording won't actually see the questions as they go up on the screen. Now, Demio works through the strength of your broadband connection at home. So for the vast majority of you this evening, you will not experience any problems with your audio or your video. But if you do, because you have a poor internet connection at your home address, there are a number of immediate action drills that you can take to improve our connectivity. The first IA drill, I always refer to as the IT crowd solution. It's basically, first of all, you refresh your page. And I know that there are, whenever I say this, there are a number of people that don't know how to do that. So in the top left-hand corner of every browser, there is an incomplete circle with an arrow. If you click on that, that will refresh your page. And that normally sorts out any problems you might have with your audio or visual. If, however, that doesn't work, then the second immediate action drill that you can take is to close down the browser and then return again using the same link that you joined this evening. And if that immediate action drill doesn't work and you have access to a different browser on your computer, so for this evening I'm using Chrome, but Demio works with Firefox, Safari, and Microsoft Edge. And if you've got access to one or other of those browsers, then you can use your link in that browser. And as I said, if one of those three immediate action drills does not work for you, then at least you can be assured that you are getting a copy of the recording. And I've put a notice at the start in the chat box that we hold a Q&A session at the end of the talk. And to save time, we always encourage you to write the question as it occurs to you during the talk. And if Eamonn subsequently covers that point later in his talk, then clearly I won't put that question to him. We've already got nearly 30 people in the room and over 60 people registered for this evening's talk. So once again, that's about average for us. You know, about 50% attend the live session. About 50% of the registrations are watching this on the recording. And as well as being given a copy of the recording, we always subsequently put a copy of it onto the SAHR website. Right, that's enough from me, I think. One or two of you are introducing yourself in the chat box, and I encourage you to do that until the talk starts. But I'm now going to ask Eamonn to come up on stage and I'll introduce our speaker this evening. Whilst he's doing that, just a reminder that next month's talk is by Dr. Glenn Price, who's going to be talking about the logistics and supply in the British Civil Wars. And when you leave the talk this evening, you'll be automatically taken to a registration page for that talk. And I would encourage you to sign up as soon as you can. Thank you. Anyway, now on screen, live to you from Cambridge, Queen's College, Cambridge, where he holds a National Army Museum sponsored research fellowship, is Dr. Eamonn O'Keeffe, who has been on the SAHR Council since 2016, and recently submitted his PhD thesis, I think in the last year or two, and it has been extremely well received. In fact, we were talking about, it's a bit like buses. These prizes seem to come along one after the other. So not only did Eamonn receive the very prestigious Courvoisier Prize from the International Commission for Military History for his thesis, he also has recently received the Pollard Prize from the from the Institute of Historical Research in recognition of the best seminar presentation given in the previous year. Once again, on the subject of his talk this evening, which is about fifes and drums. I know it's about more than that, but Eamonn, I'm certain that you can tell us more. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us this evening, and I'm going to leave the stage now and hand over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dudley, for that kind introduction, and thanks everyone for tuning in this evening. It's a pleasure to be speaking to the Society about my research, as Dudley mentioned, having been a member of the Society's council for a number of years. Now, for those who don't know me, I ought to mention at the start that my choice of topics derives in no small part from personal experience. I'm from Toronto in Canada, and I spent my summers as a high school and university student working at Fort York, a colonial outpost and battlefield from the War of 1812. As a participant and leader of the museum's Fife and Drum summer program, their Fife and Drum Corps called the Fort York Guard, I became immersed in the military music of this period in the late Georgian British Army. And I began to interpret its significance to visitors in daily demonstrations and talks. As you can imagine, this sparked my curiosity in the subject, but my interest grew further as I read memoirs and diaries from the period, some from the Anglo-American War of 1812, but many more from the soldiers who fought against Napoleon and civilians living in Britain and Ireland at the time. The wartime nation in arms, as these writings seem to suggest, was experienced by the ears as much as the eyes. Indeed, it seems that few who lived through the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars between 1793 and 1815 could forget all the noise. The streets of Edinburgh, one memoirist claimed, echoed with, quote, nothing but drumming and fifing every afternoon. Every town, the caricaturist George Cruikshank remembered, was a sort of garrison. In one place you might hear the tattoo of some youth learning to beat the drum. At another place, some march or national air being practiced on the fife, while twice daily the bugle horn was sounded through the streets to call the volunteers to drill. The difference between war and peace was acutely audible in urban centers and at local fairs. One Colchester tailor described the cacophony of drums, fifes, and trumpets that, quote, again greeted our ears after Napoleon's escape from Elba, renewing all the warlike feelings which had dissipated in the brief quiet following his abdication. Music was perhaps the most far-reaching form of entertainment in the 18th and early 19th centuries, according to the historian Mark Philp, and was critical in the struggle for the loyalty of the British people following the French Revolution. Yet research on the cultural aspects of war in this period has largely concentrated on fine art, literature, and drama. Valuable work has been done on song as a vehicle of patriotic sentiment and radical disaffection. But historians of popular politics tend to be more at home with visual symbols and the printed word than the more intangible phenomena of music and sound. Music historians, too, have paid remarkably little heed to martial music. As Geoffrey Richards observed in a study of music and British imperialism, few other genres, he said, quote, have been subject to such contempt from musicologists. This neglect mirrors the wider tendency among social and cultural historians to view the military as a peripheral institution, one that was disconnected from wider society and that therefore can be safely compartmentalized or ignored. By investigating martial music in this presentation today and in my wider thesis in the forthcoming book I'm working on, I aim to contribute to the growing body of research that instead emphasizes the breadth of interactions between soldiers and civilians and uncovers the many different impacts and deep, profound impacts of recurrent 18th century warfare on British and Irish life. Now, military music making, though by no means new to this period, expanded enormously from the outbreak of war in 1793 on account of the drastic enlargement of the armed forces. By 1814, more than 20,000 instrumentalists were serving in uniform, not only in the regular army and the militia, but in a host of part-time home defense formations, including the yeomanry, the volunteers, and the local militia. These musical warriors can be grouped into two main categories: fifers, drummers, and buglers in the infantry, and trumpeters in the cavalry served a core communications function. Their signals instructed soldiers to rise, eat, work, and sleep, and in some cases transmitted commands on the battlefield. But drummers and their analogues also performed more extensive repertoires to provide parade ground pageantry and improve morale. And in these roles, they were joined by the second category of military performer, regimental bandsmen. Military bands were sponsored by a combination of state funding and subscriptions from regimental officers who regarded music as essential to unit prestige. These ensembles featured wind instruments such as clarinets, horns, and bassoons, alongside percussion instruments inspired by Ottoman precedents. And these were often played by Black musicians, as you can see on the print in front of you. Now, there's much I could say about the role of music in the military, and those are all topics I'm going to look at, from the role in the battlefield, to morale, to unit identity. All of these things I'm going to look at in the thesis. I've looked at in the thesis and will do in the forthcoming book. But tonight, in the limited time we have, I'm going to instead focus on the presence of martial music in wider society. The limited research, which has been published on military music during the French wars, highlights rightly its significance as a recreational amenity and a symbol of state authority, but often offers assessments of impact which seem imprecise or unconvincing. Patrick O'Connell, for example, has contended that militia musicians in Ireland were important in, quote, forging and solidifying a sense of identity and loyalty among competing political factions. Yet what this identity may have been and how broadly it was shared is not specified, nor is much proof provided of music's ostensible ability to shape civilian attitudes. Trevor Herbert has been more forthright in arguing that regimental bands inculcated feelings of Britishness among the rural poor. However, his case rests entirely on a handful of accounts written by wealthy listeners and military recruits who testified to their fascination with martial music, but made no specific reference to its impact on their sense of national consciousness. So instead of assuming that martial music was an invariable crowd pleaser, I'll instead interrogate its reach and its significance by drawing on an extensive body of primary sources, including more than 100 published and manuscript accounts written by civilian listeners who reflected on what they heard. I see music, as an active and a communal medium, which prior to the advent of recorded sound had to be made each time it was heard. More of a process than a thing, music was always in some sense participatory, for audiences as well as performers were involved in giving it meaning by interpreting and responding to the tunes they encountered, be it with plaudits or with brickbats. Yet as with the case of song or print literature, discerning the actual impact of music on collective mentalities is not a straightforward task. Music could contribute to the creation of imagined communities, including nations or empires, by eliciting simultaneous expressions of public feeling. But at the same time, reactions were inherently individualized, varying based on a person's preconceptions and tastes. So I'm going to acknowledge, and as I have up front, the challenges which are inherent engaging the reception of this music. But on the other hand, I'm going to try to provide, through this talk today, a deeper understanding of the place of military music in wartime society and think about the spectrum of responses that it could elicit. So in this talk, I'm going to argue that military music was an intrusive symptom of large-scale mobilization and was central to the civilian experience of war. Far from comprising what some have called a closed musical world, regimental bands were in fact an integral part of the wider musical ecosystem. They provided sought-after entertainment in provincial towns, playing not only at military parades, but at myriad public events, including balls and dinners, civic processions, concerts, and church services. Military music was regarded as a potent means of inculcating patriotism, of intimidating political dissenters, and of asserting the sonic supremacy of the established order in a revolutionary age. The performances of drummers and bandsmen enjoyed considerable popularity across society and evoked a variety of emotional responses, including feelings of national pride and fondness for the military. Yet musical warriors also provoked irritation, controversy, and distress, not least by generating noise complaints and by exacerbating sectarianism. This talk focuses primarily on wartime Britain and Ireland, but I'm also going to consider the role of military music overseas, suggesting that it functioned as a form of soft power, which helped legitimize imperial authority, aid diplomacy, and ease relations with local inhabitants. Now, martial music was, as I hinted at the beginning, a prevalent part of the wartime soundscape. It reminded civilians of the ongoing conflict and of the military's presence in their midst. Although the intensity of this clamor varied over the course of the wars and was far more sporadic in the countryside than in towns, the expansion of the armed forces unquestionably spread military pomp far and wide, causing many English villages, according to one American traveler, to resound with French horns and trumpets. Music was also a harbinger of overseas colonization. The wife of Upper Canada's first lieutenant governor, for example, mentioned, quote, the beat of drums and the crash of falling trees in her diary. Overheard duty beatings and calls helped civilians quantify the passing hours and influence their daily routines. A lodger in Edinburgh, for example, was rudely awakened at 6 o'clock by buglers in the nearby castle, while trial witnesses described events as early in the morning, just after the drums beat, or recalled going to bed at drumbeat in Sydney in Australia. The ordinary course of military duties occasioned many opportunities for public encounters with military music. Soldiers paraded with instrumental accompaniment not only in camps and in barracks, but in streets and marketplaces and on town greens. Duty beatings known as the troop, the retreat, and the tattoo were performed through the main thoroughfares of garrison communities. Fife Major John Shipp recalled playing through Colchester twice daily, quote, followed by all the girls and boys in the town. Military custom also demanded that regimental instrumentalists strike up whenever they entered and left a sizable settlement. So 30 buglers and a most excellent band of the 95th Rifles, for example, played over the hills and far away, through every country village on an 1809 march to Dover, while 3 troops of the 23rd Light Dragoons, quote, kicked up an awful row during their progress from Chichester to Weymouth several years later, gathering crowds with bugle calls before breaking into a 15-verse song extolling their Waterloo exploits. Drummers also drew public attention to official announcements, including the imposition of curfews in Ireland during the 1798 rebellion. On taking up new quarters, regiments invariably sent around a sergeant and a drummer through town to warn residents that officers were not liable for any debts incurred by their men, a practice known as crying down the credit. Now, music's ability to generate public interest proved useful to army recruiters, who relied on drummers, fifers, Highland pipers, and trumpeters to compete for attention at bustling marketplaces and fairs. Soldiers enlisted for many reasons, not least of them economic distress and a desire for travel. But several autobiographers explicitly cited the appeal of military music as an important factor in their decision. Recruiting officers themselves certainly believed that competent performers were indispensable to their task. A captain of the Breadalbane Fencibles, for instance, noted that the performances of a regimental musician at Dumfries, quote, had a great effect in inducing men to enlist. Music could encourage enrollment even at a distance. One 18-year-old farm laborer, seized by a sudden start of patriotism, according to an officer, on hearing the drum of a Shropshire volunteer company in 1804, chased after the corps for nearly 2 miles to offer his services. Now, music was an essential ingredient of the military spectacles that proved tremendously popular with the wartime public, from local field days and mock battles to the colossal Hyde Park reviews in London, which in 1803 saw 27,000 volunteers assemble before a reported hundreds of thousands of onlookers over 2 days. Drummers, trumpeters, and band musicians saluted generals and royalty with God Save the King, struck up during inspections in the march past, and played with their unit as their units paraded to and from the ground. Interest in military music, it should be emphasized, transcended age, gender, and class. An 18-year-old factory hand visited the militia encampment at Kersal Moor near Manchester every Sunday in 1812, explaining that, quote, the band's playing made it a pleasurable outing, while a widow in County Mayo, whose lodgings overlooked the parade ground at Ballina, made a habit of inviting guests round for tea to listen to the martial music. The elite ensembles of the Foot Guards proved leading metropolitan attractions for visitors and locals alike, reliably drawing throngs of boys and grown men, gentlemen, vagabonds, and maidservants to the changing of the guard in St. James's Park. Even routine parades in market towns attracted throngs on account of the music, sometimes resulting in scuffles as soldiers struggled to hold back the crush of listeners. The significance of music for public military displays was amply appreciated by volunteer officers, who carefully choreographed the instrumental accompaniment for the formal presentation of their colors, and borrowed performers from other units to increase the splendor of the day. So the commander of the Dunfermline volunteers even changed the date of the ceremony to permit the attendance of musicians from the Breadalbane Fencibles, whom he hoped would linger long enough to play the violin at the ensuing evening ball. Now, as this request for military fiddlers suggests, the social functions of regimental bands were as valued as their contribution to martial pageantry. Officers were keen to fund militia ensembles in the belief that they would enhance genteel gatherings of county society, while aristocratic colonels routinely employed their regimental bands for dinners and fetes at their country houses. Military men made inroads with local notables as they moved between postings by organizing social occasions enlivened by their musicians, demonstrating their gallantry and refined manners through dance. Bands helped officers court women, who were seen to be particularly receptive to martial music's charms. A lieutenant of the 60th Foot even suggested that his battalion's band had been formed expressly to, quote, please the Jamaica ladies. The attendance of regimental musicians could dramatically augment the accompaniment available for provincial dances. A visitor to the Bodmin Assembly in Cornwall in 1797 noted that the usual blind fiddler had been superseded by the band of the Somerset militia, who, quote, not only occupied half the room, but stunned us with the noise of their drums and clarinets. Military musicians attended a remarkable array of public amusements and commercial entertainments, from horse races, fairs, village feasts, to hot air balloon demonstrations. The musicians of the Coldstream Guards, dubbed the Duke of York's band after their longtime colonel, not only became a mainstay of London balls, but regularly appeared in uniform at Vauxhall Gardens, the pleasure gardens you can see on the slide here. Uniformed ensembles were also difficult to miss at provincial theaters, where they contributed musical interludes or filled the orchestra pits on nights patronized by their officers. Such thespian outings did not prevent regimental bands from performing in sacred settings. Military musicians were most important as church singers and instrumentalists in overseas colonies, where there were fewer sources of alternate sources of entertainment and musical accompaniment rather. But militia bands were also engaged in Irish garrison towns to increase the appeal of both Protestant and Catholic charity sermons. The goodwill generated by these public-facing performances is amply apparent from press reports and diaries praising both the regimental musicians and the officers who underwrote them. A Clonmel correspondent thanked the colonel of the Royal Tyrone Militia for permitting its, quote, admirable band to play during the intervals of a performance of Shakespeare's Henry IV, describing the gesture as, proof of his, quote, obliging attentions to promote the gaiety and amusements of this town. Military performers attended a range of communal rituals and ceremonies, contributing to the 18th century growth and elaboration of street processions. By attending town banquets and cavalcades that perpetuated civic traditions and marked the installation of new magistrates, military bands helped reinforce social ties among urban elites and publicly emphasize their position to assembled crowds. Regimental ensembles routinely solemnized ship launches, colliery and canal openings, and the laying of foundation stones for public buildings, symbolically tying local enterprise to national or imperial authority. The music of military bandsmen and recruiting drummers, moreover, conspicuously figured in deferential receptions accorded to prominent visitors, including war heroes and royalty, combining with cheers, cannon fire, and the ringing of church bells to create an impression of joyous approbation from the community as a whole. Regimental bands were equally audible at the elaborate and well-attended funerals of fallen generals, statesmen, and ordinary volunteer soldiers. The burial procession of the poet Robert Burns, formerly of the Royal Dumfries Volunteers, featured cavalry musicians playing Handel's Dead March in Saul before the bier. Landed families hoping to impress tenants and neighbors with their largesse likewise relied on military bands to enhance extravagant revels, honoring important rites of passage. In 1799, an agent of the Duke of Rutland hired a Sheffield volunteer ensemble for celebrations of the aristocrats' coming of age at Haddon Hall, which reportedly drew more than 10,000 people. Quote, "The whole business would have been very flat without music," he explained. Besides catering to the great and the good, regimental bands were widely employed by Masonic lodges and friendly societies to attend feast day meals and announce the progress of processions, helping members celebrate their solidarity and advertise their fraternities to outsiders. Now, despite contemporary misgivings about mixing party politics and soldiering, military bands also participated in election time rituals and other partisan displays. Lord Milton, the Whig candidate contesting Yorkshire in 1807, was welcomed into Halifax for the hustings by, quote, a double band of music and the drummers and fifers of the volunteer corps. Other volunteer and militia performers saluted successful parliamentary candidates in Bristol, North Shields, County Mayo, and elsewhere. Even regular army musicians occasionally participated in the chairing ceremonies of newly minted MPs. There are few indications of official efforts to curtail such performances, save for an investigation of the Knightsbridge volunteers for saluting Sir Francis Burdett with their drums beating during an 1804 by-election. Burdett's credentials as a radical MP and an opponent of the government undoubtedly heightened ministerial alarm. But the Home Secretary's condemnation of the episode as destructive to military discipline and the freedom of election appeared to censure politicized military displays, irrespective of the partisan stripe. Now, thus far, I've considered military music as a component of public festivities and military display. But regimental ensembles also appeared at concerts, where music itself was the main event. Bandsmen of both auxiliary and professional regiments routinely gave public concerts and used the profits from ticket sales to supplement their military salaries. Keen to profit from wartime patriotism, civilian concert organizers seasoned their programs with loyalist and military-inspired fare, taking care to publicize the involvement of regimental musicians. Military bandsmen and musically talented officers collaborated with local performers wherever they were posted, providing, quote, a strong reinforcement to the orchestra at provincial concerts from Framlingham to Montrose. The composer John Marsh, for example, relied heavily on martial musicians stationed in Chichester for his winter concert series, and consequently lamented the loss of particularly good regimental bands as a great loss to his lineup. When the regiments left, he thought, "No, that's terrible because who's going to play our bassoon?" The number of military musicians concentrated in wartime Cork and Dublin facilitated concerts there on a previously unexampled scale. Orchestras of 70 to 150 instrumentalists, encompassing the combined bands of each garrison, played descriptive battle pieces before audiences of thousands, enabling listeners to imagine themselves, according to one newspaper review, as amidst the scenes of danger and awful confusion at Alexandria, Trafalgar, or elsewhere. Most of these indoor concerts were exclusive occasions with ticket prices of 3 shillings or more, limiting attendance to the relatively affluent. But military musicians also reached wider audiences through free open-air performances. Bands not only played on parade, but lingered afterwards to oblige onlookers, performing eclectic assortments of dance tunes, popular ballads, theatrical songs, and selections from fashionable continental composers. An 1801 Portsmouth guidebook listed military band performances on public promenades as one of the town's principal visitor attractions, while all ranks and denominations, according to a Presbyterian minister, gathered in large numbers to hear regimental musicians playing along the walls of wartime Derry on Sunday afternoons. General orders for the garrison of Valletta in Malta even instituted a rota for open-air performances, with the bands of the 27th, 44th, and Sicilian regiments, each instructed to give concerts 2 evenings a week outside the governor's palace between 6:30 and 8 o'clock. Military ensembles drew audiences not only due to the wartime vogue for martial ceremonial, but because they impressed listeners with their large size, their generally good performance standards, and novel sights and sounds. In 1793, for example, a dazzled village innkeeper described the 17-strong ensemble of the West Middlesex Militia as the best band he had ever heard, singling out the black percussionists for their, quote, very grand appearance. Music enthusiasts who flocked to public band performances paid close attention to the merits of different military ensembles and evaluated the skills of individual performers. A newspaper contributor in Cork, writing in 1840, credited Irish militia bands with honing, quote, the musical tastes of our citizens for which they are still proverbial. A posse of perennial band listeners developed their appreciation of fugues, dynamics, and assorted aspects of music theory by attending parades and guard mountings in wartime. And according to this article, quote, from amateurs became performers themselves. Several other 19th century observers echoed the view that the proliferation of regimental ensembles had increased public interest in music, though not all welcomed the development. In 1801, a correspondent of the Gentleman's Magazine fretted that the number of military bands established in the kingdom, in tandem with an elite musical mania, had, quote, so much extended a degree of knowledge in music that some discarded soldier, servant, or player scrapes the fiddle in every parish and promotes drunkenness, lewdness, and idleness by bringing the lads and girls together to dance and by teaching other loitering fellows to fiddle also. Now, the public evinced their fascination with martial music through widespread imitation. A Londoner complained in 1811 about groups of strolling performers who had somehow acquired bass drums and were playing, quote, the loudest species of military music through the city streets. The Turkish percussion instruments introduced to the Coldstream Guards by the Duke of York had become a fashionable novelty in elite drawing rooms by the late 1790s, prompting wealthy ladies to hire black musicians from the regiment as instructors on the cymbal and the tambourine. You can see that in the image on the screen. The vogue for these clamorous instruments, praised for promoting feminine agility and graceful movement, spread beyond the capital. The daughter of a Perthshire minister took tambourine lessons from a military bandsman in Dundee. Published editions of military marches were marketed to a burgeoning cohort of amateur female pianists, while other regimental tunes gained popularity as dances and were copied into the music books of civilian flautists and fiddlers. Caught up in the wartime enthusiasm for volunteering, boys and girls sought to reproduce martial music in pervasive games of military make-believe. Catholic schoolboys in Shropshire, for example, acquired an ex-volunteer drum and formed a band to accompany their imitation regiment. Juvenile interest in military music was even recognized and exploited by toy makers. Some of the earliest sheets produced by the London publisher William West, who printed paper cutouts of theatrical characters from 1811, depict the celebrated bands of the 1st and the 3rd Foot Guards. You can see that again on the slide. Finally, audiences listening to regimental performers were widely known to tap along and move in time to the music, miming military deportments and physically emulating marching rhythms. Quote, military manners prevail at Montreal as at Quebec, reported an American visitor in 1817. Quote, the rabble flock in crowds to regimental parades, and even the women of any appearance make a point of stepping to a march. Besides providing popular leisure, musical warriors shaped domestic perceptions of war, of nationhood, and the armed forces. Most obviously, their performances fed the contemporary pleasure culture of war, encouraging civilians far removed from the battlefield carnage to view military display as romantic and compelling. The forms and functions of martial music became sufficiently familiar to the domestic public to warrant inclusion in a host of satirical caricatures. Ignominious defeats and dismissals were dramatized as regimental drumming out ceremonies, while Whig politicians and opposition journalists were mockingly portrayed as recruiting drummers for political radicalism. Just as Jack Tar, the everyman sailor, symbolized masculine stoicism, the Highland Piper became an emblem of Scottish nationhood and military prowess. A satirical print of 1803, which celebrated British victory in Egypt by portraying a kilted soldier playing Napoleon like a set of bagpipes, was popular enough to merit reproduction by multiple English manufacturers on various commemorative ceramics. George Clark, a regimental piper who continued playing on a Portuguese battlefield in 1808 after being shot in the groin, became one of the most vaunted common soldiers and sailors of the period. The Highland societies recognized Clark's valor with trophy pipes and medals. Artists captured his likeness in paintings and engravings. Newspapers even updated their readers on the soldier celebrities' later combat performances and deployments. The publicity around Clark set a trend for the celebration of battlefield piping, which continued long after the Napoleonic Wars, and also buttressed a romanticized view of Scottish Highlanders as an ancient martial race, moved to impetuous bravery by their traditional national music. By 1813, the Caithness, a landowner, Sir John Sinclair, felt justified in asserting, quote, there is no sound which the immortal Wellington hears with more delight, or the marshals of France with more dismay, than the notes of a Highland pibroch. And as the renown of Caledonian pipers suggests, the variety of military instruments, repertoires, and performances could make the military's multinational character manifest to domestic audiences. The Roscommon Militia, for example, left the inhabitants of Plymouth in no doubt of their origins by parading through town with their band and their drums playing on St. Patrick's Day in 1812 rather. And soldiers of the King's German Legion spent Sunday evenings dancing and singing the music of their homelands on the parade ground in Winchester, drawing a vast concourse of spectators who were delighted by the excellent band and the novelty of the scene. Yet exposure to unfamiliar music could also strengthen feelings of discordant difference rather than harmonious cooperation between peoples, with disdainful English listeners interpreting what they called the barbarous racket of the Highland pipes as evidence of Scottish backwardness. And in an age when loyalists often viewed allegiance to the king and country as a personal and emotive attachment, and music was widely known to influence feelings and identity, it's hardly surprising to learn that military music, was considered a potent form of propaganda. Successive invasion threats and the revival of popular radicalism after the French Revolution obliged the British state and the propertied classes, notwithstanding their disdain for democracy, to make unprecedented appeals for mass support. The battle of ideas between loyalism and radicalism was waged in newspapers, sermons, and public meetings, but also through an outpouring of music and song. Commentators like the singer-songwriter Charles Dibdin recognized music's ability to excite Republican passions in France, think the Marseillaise, and argued it could also stir counter-revolutionary sentiment at home. What is more, the political agency of music was recognized and intentionally cultivated by military officers. Posted at Manchester in 1793, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Thornton of the West York Militia organized a regimental band to draw larger crowds to his parades and impress them with, quote, the sentiments of loyalty on the minds of the populace by continually amusing them with airs adapted to that purpose, or engaging them in a chorus which never fails to raise the smallest spark of British loyalty into a flame. Thornton could not think of a, quote, more effectual exorcism against the demon of sedition than a full chorus of God Save the King. And indeed, regimental bands regularly play the patriotic odes of Rule Britannia and Britain Strike Home, and generally concluded concerts and military reviews with God Save the King. And the popularity of this last tune, which was praised by one Peninsular veteran as, quote, a strong bulwark of the throne, reflected the monarch's apotheosis as a focus for patriotic feeling. By the closing years of the Napoleonic conflict, God Save the King was increasingly described not simply as a national air, but as the national anthem. And music was a vital feature of the patriotic and regal celebrations, which grew in frequency and scale during the final decades of George III's reign. The garrison of Roscrea, County Tipperary, in common with all others in Ireland, for example, marked the monarch's birthday in 1810 by mustering near the market house and firing the customary 3 volleys, interspersed with yeomanry trumpet fanfares, drum rolls, and renditions of God Save the King from a militia band. Officers across the United Kingdom recognized the importance of dignifying celebratory dinners, reviews, and public carousing with appropriate music on the 4th of June. A regimental musician in Lancashire cancelled an engagement in 1805 because his colonel had, quote, given strict instructions that not one of the band must be absent on that day, it being the King's birthday. Military bands were equally imperative to celebrations of George III's Golden Jubilee in 1809, helping foster a joyous atmosphere and accompanying crowds as they sang along to national tunes. A dearth of music, conversely, jeopardized the emotional impact. A Liverpool woman believed that civic festivities had been ruined by, quote, a woeful want of music, complaining that the 2 bands present were simply unable to enliven the full length of the Jubilee procession. Regimental performers also helped villages and port towns celebrate news of peace and victory. Accompanying open-air dinners, as you can see here on the slide, one in Aylsham with the band of music playing from the raised platform, but also parades and even serenading tens of thousands of spectators at effigy burnings of Napoleon. Such patriotic displays relied on the initiative of the landed gentry and urban elites, who rewarded military bands for their efforts with meals and extra pay. But the festivities undeniably had a popular appeal. The journalist Charles Knight recalled how reports of the Battle of Salamanca prompted immediate nocturnal exultation in Windsor. Quote, the great mass of our population joined the 29th Regiment on a triumphant march through the streets as its band played the inspiriting strains of the downfall of Paris. Far from being an insignificant element of pre-Victorian state pageantry, military music was prominent in lavish national spectacles intended as counter-revolutionary ripostes to the large-scale festivals staged by Republican and Imperial France. The public thanksgiving for naval victories in 1797, which drew up to 200,000 people, featured bands of the Royal Marines, brought in specially from Portsmouth and Chatham, and the musicians of manifold volunteer corps playing at, quote, an interval of every 5 minutes in the procession through London. Musicians and drummers of the Foot Guards also regularly appeared at court levees and attended the magnificent installation of Garter Knights at Windsor Castle in 1805, which was immediately preceded by the public presentation of silver kettle drums to the Royal Horse Guards. Some 28,000 regular and auxiliary troops turned out for Lord Nelson's funeral the following year, with their bands playing and drums rolling on muffled instruments before silent crowds. Volunteer musicians even encouraged mourning beyond the capital by performing dirges at locally organized memorials for the fallen admiral in towns such as Darlington and Carmarthen. Now, documenting the reach of military music is, of course, far easier than determining its impact on individual listeners. A wealth of evidence drawn from memoirs, diaries, and correspondence does, however, suggest that it could elicit strong emotions, including awe, joy, sorrow, and national pride. James Silk Buckingham, who witnessed an 1812 review at Gibraltar on the king's birthday while working as a merchant captain, remembered how, quote, overpoweringly grand salutes of artillery and musketry, followed by a rendition of God Save the King from all the military bands present, prompted what he called feelings of patriotism, loyalty, and pride in British supremacy. Music could also foster positive views of the military among the laboring poor. One farmhand was much delighted to encounter a militia band in Buckingham in 1802 and later enlisted as a soldier himself. Yet responses to martial performances were diverse and often deeply personal, depending on the instruments, on the repertoire, and the context. A visitor to an Irish encampment in 1795 claimed he panted for military glory on hearing the shrill fife and drum. But an officer's wife could not avoid crying when listening to Caledonian tunes played by a fife major, because they evoked nostalgic memories of her Scottish home and father. Disorderly and unaccomplished regimental performers could leave a bad impression, as is clear from the diaries of the Nottinghamshire stocking maker, Joseph Woolley. He ridiculed the musicians of the local bunny volunteers as preposterous and incompetent gluttons, quote, laughed at by all that heard them. The collective attitudes of crowds are, however, very difficult to reconstruct with any confidence. Although the lower ranks of people paid profound attention to military bands, according to a Franco-American traveler, and were sometimes moved to tears by the music, it's not clear how far such listening experiences influenced their attitudes towards the monarchy, the war, and the state. Audiences could certainly listen with ambivalence, hearing and enjoying martial music, while remaining resistant to its political implications or disdainful of the individuals honored by its strains. This potential for subversive listening was recognized by John Gamble, an Ulster Presbyterian physician and former military surgeon. Noting that regimental bands ended their performances at a Dublin pleasure garden with God Save the King and the Irish national air of St. Patrick's Day in the morning, he described the first tune as a draught which must be swallowed, and St. Patrick's Day as the sweetener to it. Although listeners did not always embrace the intended resonance, I'd argue nonetheless that military music deserves consideration as a formidable type of symbolic power. Regimental performances help the governing elite assert greater control over public spaces and soundscapes, encouraging popular participation in patriotic events and fostering what William Tullett, another historian, has termed, quote, emotional atmospheres conducive to loyalty. The burning of effigies of Thomas Paine across England in 1792 and 93, sometimes accompanied by recruiting drummers and military bandsmen, was taken by a Cheshire clergyman as evidence of an overpowering anti-radical consensus. Quote, loyalty triumphs in every corner of the kingdom, crowed the Reverend Reginald Heber, and musicians pervaded every street playing and singing God Save Great George our King. Military music aimed to intimidate the discontented by broadcasting the presence of the forces of order, including through targeted church and king demonstrations outside the homes of leading radicals. A veteran of a Glaswegian volunteer unit raised to counter post-war disaffection in 1819 believed that its bugles and band not only heartened loyal listeners, but, quote, conveyed notes of warning to would-be insurrectionists, instructing them to continue still in peace and quietness. The acoustic strength of loyalism may well have encouraged a predisposition for the status quo in an era of intensified political controversy, as Mark Philp has argued. But this ascendancy was nevertheless frequently contested, for example, through the dissemination of radical ballads and altercations over the singing of God Save the King in provincial theaters. Even French prisoners of war sought to continue the ideological conflict of the 1790s in song, disrupting celebrations of the king's birthday from their prison hulks and countering performances of British regimental bands with renditions of La Marseillaise. Moreover, it must be stressed that the popular patriotism, which military music appears to have encouraged and amplified, was volatile and conditional, tending to coalesce during invasion scares and dissipate amidst disenchantment with war and its effects. The plebeian inhabitants who listened to a military band outside Cardiff Castle with evident gratification in 1800 may well have joined a demonstration against high food prices the following year. On that occasion, the performances of the Cardigan militia musicians who turned out with their comrades to police the protest and played, quote, at intervals amidst the noise of men, women, and children vociferating, well, that surely had an altogether more ominous resonance. Musical signals were essential for coordinating the military's response to civil disturbances, but the audibility of drums sometimes had counterproductive consequences. The sheer noise might attract additional onlookers instead of dispersing disorderly crowds, or draw intoxicated off-duty soldiers out from their barracks who then began taking part in street affrays. Policing duties made the military unpopular in turbulent manufacturing towns. A yeomanry trumpet major's attempt to sound the assembly during a Sheffield riot was reputedly curtailed by a well-aimed potato, which knocked out 2 of his teeth. Musical warriors were scorned, mutilated, and even killed because of their association with official repression, particularly in Ireland, where trumpeters and drummers were tasked with flogging civilians and even executing insurgents during the 1798 rebellion. Indeed, public military performances could provide a focus for popular dissension. The commandant of the Wakefield local militia, for example, reported in 1810 that the town's watermen had long made a sport of striking his drummers and hurling rocks or dead fowl as they beat the tattoo through the streets, requiring the deployment of armed escorts. He added that the band of another regiment had recently suffered a similar battering in Leeds. These hostile receptions reflected not only political disaffection, but national prejudices or antipathy towards particular regiments. Drummers of the Leitrim militia were, quote, most wantonly attacked by the mob in Bristol and cursed as damned Irish rebels during the evening tattoo, after an officer of the corps knocked a local boy unconscious for taunting him with an offensive song. Nowhere was military music more contentious than in Ireland, where the performance of so-called party tunes provoked civil unrest and violence in an atmosphere of heightened religious division. The most recognizable of these sectarian anthems were Boyne Water and Protestant Boys, also called the Lily Burlero, which eulogized the victories of William of Orange, and Croppies Lie Down, which glorified the brutal suppression of the 1798 rebellion. Although many Catholics were prepared to attend celebrations of battlefield triumphs or frequent band performances in public squares, they expressed disgust on hearing party tunes performed by fifers and bandsmen, regarding the melodies as provocations, which insinuated Catholic treachery and reveled in their subjugation. Militia musicians also appeared in processions organized by the Orange Order, a fledgling fraternity dedicated to the defense of Protestant ascendancy. Having initially condoned the Orangemen as a loyalist prop to state authority during the febrile 1790s, officers and government officials later forbade drummers and bandsmen of regular and militia regiments from attending their parades to avoid antagonizing Ireland's Catholic majority population. Yet efforts to moderate the repertoires of the part-time yeomanry, which was closely aligned with the Orange Order and not so amenable to government control, were notably less successful. As Robert Peel, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, lamented in the wake of a deadly riot triggered by a yeomanry fifer, there was, quote, enough bad blood in Tipperary without those blockheads aggravating it with their party tunes. And you could see a really visceral and disturbing image here on the screen from an anti-government publication that depicts a yeomanry with their fifes and drums playing a party tune, dragging people that they've shot through the streets. It's not clear if this particular incident actually took place, but I think it speaks to how imbricated music was, how implicated it was in sectarian violence at this time, and was a symbol to some of the partisan nature of government forces during the wars. But on the other side of the coin, it wasn't just Catholics who were offended by military music, because drummers and bandsmen of the Irish militia, well, they managed to offend Ulster Protestants and unsettle them by accompanying soldiers to Sunday Mass, providing an unwelcome auditory reminder that the security of the Protestant listeners depended on what were often predominantly Catholic regiments. Religion also engendered public criticism of military music for violating the sanctity of the Sabbath. In 1802, a resident of Durham complained that volunteer drums and fifes were, quote, almost incessantly heard in some part or other of this town on a Sunday from 9 in the morning till 9 at night, drowning out church bells and encouraging incredible numbers of young people to indulge in indecent singing and dancing. A preacher in Hull likewise fulminated against Sunday military displays and believed that silencing the regimental bands, which he considered the principal attraction, would discourage the masses from indulging in such irreverent recreation. Military performances in or near churches were also scrutinized for appropriate solemnity. A Bristol Mirror correspondent protested that the, quote, merry and cheering quickstep played by fifers and drummers as soldiers left Sunday worship in the city's cathedral was more suited to a vulgar hop at a fair. Yet criticism of Sunday band concerts in public squares, unlike later in the century when they actually were banned, were generally laughed off by army officers and attracted limited support, even among the ordained. When Parson James Woodford chanced on a Welsh militia band during a Sunday amble in rural Somerset, he clearly had no reservations about their performance, lingering until late in the evening and contributing to a collection for the men. Military music drew ire not only on account of religion and politics, but also because it simply disrupted daily life. The din of recruiting drummers and regimental bands distracted letter writers, discomfited the sick, and generated a litany of noise complaints. A budding Folkestone artillery bugler, for example, alleged that a local baker had threatened to break every bone in his body if he dared to play again, while a Scottish tenant farmer claimed that the constant clamor of 16 fencible drummers practicing near his home had traumatized his wife and caused the death of a cow. The military inclination to parade through garrison towns with bands playing at ungodly hours, sometimes simply for a lark, cannot have been well received by sleepless inhabitants. Militiamen passing through Salisbury in 1796 kept up, quote, an incessant drumming in the middle of the night for 2 hours, according to Lord Cathcart, who was reticent to forbid the noise because they seemed to enjoy it. Moreover, the distinctive musical signals performed in response to rumored French landings or Irish insurrections prompted recurrent panic, both in urban centers and in large swathes of the countryside. A Northumberland farmer recorded villagers' reactions to one false alarm in 1804. Quote, the drums beat to arms, the trumpets sounded, the old women fainted, the young women wept and howled for the loss of their sweethearts and husbands, the dogs barked, and in short, poor Wooler was never in such a state before. Military music also frightened horses, routinely. Experienced riders recognized the need to give soldiers a wide berth, because as one termed it, their mounts did not much relish military noise. But at least 5 civilians were killed, and many more injured in some way by being trampled or thrown from carriages and saddles after horses were spooked by drumming. Concern over skittish draft animals clearly lay behind a Dublin garrison order, preventing drummers from practicing near roads and canals. A visitor to Edinburgh was, however, amazed by the steadiness of cart and carriage horses when passing regiment after regiment with fifes and drums in the streets, which he attributed to their prolonged acclimatization with soldiers and their sonic accompaniment in the Scottish capital. So far, I've explored martial music primarily as an aspect of British and Irish wartime experience, but military ensembles were also mainstays of public life in the expanding colonial empire. By attending theater performances and tiger hunts, or playing on promenades, military bandsmen provided European cultural amenities in overseas settings and facilitated social interactions among colonial elites. According to Elizabeth Simcoe, the balls and concerts given by the Royal Fusiliers, invariably featuring, quote, the fine performers of their band, made its officers very popular at Quebec, where, as she explained, dancing is so favorite an amusement. By playing for peace celebrations, saint days, and royal birthdays, military bandsmen reinforced links with the United Kingdom and fostered an impression of imperial unity. Regimental musicians also announced the arrival and departure of colonial governors, publicly underscoring their status as royal representatives. As in Britain, outdoor band performances reliably drew large crowds. But we should note that the dearth of accounts from listeners of color inhibits the recovery of attitudes towards military music beyond those of white settlers and imperial elites. That said, the reports of British observers certainly suggest that regimental instrumentalists intrigued and entertained colonial listeners, from Buddhist clerics to enslaved people. As one officer recalled of the Cape Colony, quote, whenever a regiment came out, bringing a new supply of music, in 2 or 3 days, you would hear the slaves whistling all of the airs. But military music could also impress and intimidate in a kind of sonic demonstration of coercive imperial authority. The army that welcomed the Governor General of India to Malacca in 1811, according to the Malayan writer Abdullah bin Abdul Qadir, generated an awesome avalanche of music and noise comparable to what he called the sound of the last trumpet on Judgment Day before an audience of thousands of all races. Music should be seen as a form of soft power abroad. Its auditory appeal often seems to have improved relations between British soldiers and foreign populations. One officer stationed in Demerara, invited to attend the wedding anniversary of plantation owners in the captured Dutch colony, recalled how the arrival of regimental musicians operated like magic on the household, rapidly bringing fraus and frauleins to every window. Recognizing the popularity of military bands with French and Iberian civilians during the Peninsular War, commanders routinely ordered them to perform publicly to thank inhabitants for food and hospitality, or to entice Spanish senoras to share a dance after parade. On Wellington's triumphant 1812 entry into Salamanca, military ensembles whipped the crowds into a state of exultation. Quote, the electric effect of the music, according to an officer present, was impossible to describe. But regimental performances obviously did not preclude tensions with local people, and they could even cause offense. The determination of British battalions to march through Calais with drums beating, bands playing, and colors flying after Waterloo caused repeated standoffs with civic authorities, who balked at what they deemed hostile triumphalism. Finally, military music was a significant element of the rituals of diplomacy. Regimental bands played for balls organized by British consuls and took part in audiences with foreign dignitaries or indigenous chiefs. Martial music orally evoked the anti-Napoleonic coalition, both in the aftermath of Waterloo, when Prussian bands favored British forces with God Save the King on the battlefield, and during military reviews attended by Allied officers and royalty. Regimental music making, as with grandiose architecture, was intended to impress Indian rulers with British power and cultural prowess. Lord Wellesley, who championed ostentatious spectacle as Governor General of India, quote, never rested until he got every man of the 10th Foot's superlative band to join his viceregal entourage. The perceived importance of music in representing British interests abroad is amply illustrated by the inclusion of military bands in the Macartney and Amherst diplomatic missions to China at the start and end of these wars. In the event, the Chinese court simply seemed indifferent to European music, but it's telling that Lord Amherst insisted on bringing the musicians over the emperor's objections because he considered them what he called, quote, an essential part of the splendor required. Music itself even became a bargaining chip in international negotiations. British authorities agreed to train a European-style military ensemble for the musically inclined King of Madagascar in 1820 as part of a treaty forbidding the slave trade, transporting 8 Malagasy boys to Mauritius to study under an army bandmaster. So tonight I've argued that military music was a valued source of entertainment and pageantry, a prevalent medium of cultural propaganda, and an intrusive, everyday reminder of war and its effects. Historians of these conflicts often stress an increasing separation between professional soldiers and wider society, not least because of the widespread construction of barracks. But scrutiny of martial music, I think, highlights the remarkable degree to which the military made its presence felt and heard in British and Irish streets. If music, like uniforms, helped military men in some ways stand out from the crowd, it also exemplified and encouraged continued connections between soldiers and civilians. Appreciating the reach of military music also has substantial implications for broader narratives about the development of musical culture. While the existing literature in this period rightly highlights a precocious commercialization and rising consumer demand, it tends to overlook the military significance as a major sponsor of instrumental activity, and also as an arbiter of musical taste. As the historian Holger Hook has argued, war and the British state were more important catalysts of cultural activity in this period than is generally supposed. Historians of popular music as well have asserted that early wind bands were relegated to providing simply an auditory backdrop to public events, with their performances only becoming the center of attention with the advent of brass band concerts in the later 19th century. Yet, as I've shown this evening, military bands were already staging accessible open-air concerts of a generally high standard for large and socially diverse audiences during the French Wars. Indeed, the unprecedented prominence of military music making in wartime is central to explaining the subsequent spread of working-class wind and brass bands, many of which were led by retired regimental musicians and clad in quasi-martial attire. But besides revealing the significant cultural impact of military music in an era of prolonged and intensive conflict, I've explored the political salience of regimental performances. Although recent writings by historians tends to present music primarily as a radical instrument for challenging prevailing power structures, it has been at least as significant as an agent or expression of patriotism and conformity, as David Kennerly notes. The prominence of martial music and patriotic song in royal and civic pageantry, far from being a Victorian invented tradition, as is often implied, was a well-established Georgian practice. Plenty of evidence suggests that individual listeners enjoyed and felt deeply moved by these performances. Wider claims, on the other hand, about the impact of all this music on collective mentalities and attitudes are a bit more difficult to substantiate. As I've argued this evening, audience responses were neither uniform nor consistently receptive. A melody or a drum beat that was aesthetically pleasing to one ear and reassuring could also be irritating, sacrilegious, or alarming to another. Contention over party tunes in Ireland, in particular, demonstrates the importance of context and repertoire in determining how people respond to the music. In the main, however, I think military music does appear to have helped bridge divisions between professional soldiers and civilians, improving the military's image in an era when redcoats were often resented on account of their disorderly behavior, impositions on local communities, and policing responsibilities. Regimental performers collectively comprised a cultural force that wartime radicalism simply could not match in terms of its public prominence, its scale, and distribution. Their music helped the governing classes assert acoustic control over public spaces and soundscapes and mobilize crowds to create an impression of mass support for the war and the prevailing social order. It therefore proved an important weapon in the arsenal of the British state, in an era when the loyalties of the people could not simply be taken for granted, but instead needed to be constantly cultivated and reconstituted. Thanks very much. I think there'll be time for questions. And I know I didn't include any, we'll actually put the slides up for a second. I didn't include any clips of music in the presentation, which I'm very sorry for, but I've added a few images of CDs. If you're looking to listen to a bit more of this music, those are fruitful lines of inquiry to pursue. I was worried it would be a bit too difficult trying to figure out how to get the audio working on Demio, but there are some good images to follow up if you're looking for a little bit more of this repertoire, and the YouTube videos online.
Eamonn, thank you so much. A little known fact about me is that I was brought up in the Salvation Army, and you have just answered a question that's always intrigued me during your talk, which is the fascination the Salvation Army has with the tambourine. And I can now see why ladies in the Salvation Army play the tambourine, or the timbrel, as they would call it, and where it came from. And interestingly, of course, the Salvation Army wanted to have a band, so it had bands. But our bands were always brass bands, which reflected the Victorian brass band movement, if you like. Military music has always been more about the wind ensemble. And yet, by the late Victorian age, a lot of particularly volunteer forces and later the territorial force had brass bands rather than military bands. Do you know anything about that and how that developed?
Yeah. Well, there's a tradition of, the military band is seen as kind of the mixed wind and brass format. So it's got the woodwind instruments in the mix as well, whereas all brass bands obviously do not. And there's always been a kind of assumption that that means that brass bands are actually not really that closely related to military ones. And this is something historians have said, okay, maybe there's some sort of vague connection, but this is a kind of product of either sort of middle class cultural values or kind of working class ingenuity, or the factory owners telling them what to do. This is a totally new form that's created in the 1830s, and the 1840s, and 50s, based on the new instruments that are available. But actually, if you look at the historic newspapers, the records that survived, the first brass bands in Britain were military ones. And so what you have is military bands innovating with the instruments that are available. And so they continue to have, as military bands today are, have the mixed woodwind and brass format. But many are go with brass, entirely brass bands. And in the kind of mid-19th century, even as early as the 1830s, you've got regiments that have the full band, and then they have the brass band, so they can actually do both. And so one of the things I've been able to show is actually how significant the military was in actually creating the brass band idiom or format. It's not just that you've got a lot of veterans who are instructors, or they have very similar military uniforms, but in fact, the very first brass bands were established in the mid 1830s. The very first one, late 1810s, we know there was one already in, I think, the 15th Regiment of Foot. There's another up in Glasgow in 1819. In the 1820s, a lot of regimental bands are experimenting with the all brass format. And when you look at the first civilian brass bands, first of all, the newspapers acknowledge, like, we're the first civilian brass band to do this. And they're always kind of implicitly being like, the military already has them. And when you look at the leaders of them in local communities and in county towns, the very first civilian brass band, which we know of, that has a title attached to it, in Leamington Spawn Warwick in the late 1820s, is founded by a former trumpet major who's at Waterloo. So you can show how both the military is pioneering the brass format, which then gets taken off and used in so many different directions in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and and through to today, school bands, miners bands, etc., Salvation Army bands. But you also see in some of these very first sort of civilian amateur bands that are not church bands, but they're outside bands emulating military ones. These brass ones are being led by ex-military guys who are using the new instruments that are available, the new valved and slide instruments in the 1820s and early 1830s already.
Great.
And key bugles as well.
Thank you. That's a very full answer. Thank you. Paul's asked this question: does there exist a list or inventory of musical battle pieces from the time of the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars? I'm
trying to figure out what battle pieces means here, because the battle, I'll give, I guess, two answers to this. There's something called a battle piece, which was a kind of, we now think of it as classical music. They were sort of churned out, often not very good, but it would say the Battle of Alexander or the Battle of Vittoria, and you could play it on the piano. It would have sections that would sort of emulate the cries of the wounded, or they'd have sort of bugle calls within it. And you play it on piano, but you kind of hear the da 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 da, something like that. So it would make it sound like you were on the battlefield. Often how convincing it was is another question, but these were marketed and sold in large quantities. I don't know if there's an inventory, but there's a Penelope Chase, I think. There's a PhD thesis which has been written down in the University of Southampton which includes a lot of discussion of these battle pieces, which are often found in kind of libraries and domestic libraries and country houses. Or so I think you could definitely, looking at library catalogs too, say the British Library, you could definitely find the full list of these that are published, often by sort of hack musicians, civilian musicians, as a kind of sort of souvenir of Trafalgar. There's been a big battle. Here we can maybe get a kind of musical sense of it through music, and you can sort of take the war into your living room. How does that sound? Into your drawing room and play it at home. So that's battle pieces. I'm wondering if the question is more about sort of bugle calls and pieces that were played on the battlefield. Military bands didn't typically play on the battlefield. They didn't sort of play Rule Britannia, whilst the guns were playing. They had other things to do. They're typically stretcher bearers. There are a couple exceptions to that, but the general rule is no, they didn't play in battle. But the bugle calls and drum beats were relatively codified. They're published. And they do exist. I could share some of you with them. Although there's as with so many things, there are many innovations in the field where regiments keep, especially with the bugle calls, they sort of start out with the point of you need to have very few calls to ensure that it's kind of audible to everyone, because if you have 100, no one can remember. But then they keep saying, oh well, we should have one for Form Square, we should have one for this. So it's clear from looking at the printed the text and the and scores when in these manuals versus what they're actually doing. And sometimes some of the manuals say, some of the regiments are just doing their own thing. They've kept their own bugle calls, even though we've published standard ones. Please, can we all get with the program? But we certainly have what the prescribed ones were, and those are available. And in fact, the Napoleonic Wars, this is the time where the duty calls and sort of battlefield signal communications of the bugle calls are actually codified at trumpet sounds as well for the first time properly, including ones like the last post, which obviously is still very resonant today. All these ones are sort of published by authority the first time in the 1790s, where the army is saying you will now play these. They don't necessarily get a full compliance, but they certainly do a lot better than before, whereas a little bit more each regiment did what they will.
Thank you. Paul's asked again, do we have any biographical information about individual black musicians at this period?
Yes, thanks. We do. There's a chap named John Ellis, who's former soldier himself in the British Army. I think he lives near Bradford. He did a PhD in 2001 on I think the University of Nottingham on military black soldiers in the British Army around the Napoleonic Wars. Most of them were musicians. Some weren't, but most we can clearly see were in military bands, or they were trumpeters in cavalry regiments. It varies hugely how much information, but very often the pension records survive, and the army in the pay list don't actually list race or other kind of physical descriptions, but in the pension records they do, because you needed that to go back when you're collecting your pension. They could say, you're actually 5'4", swarthy complexion, whatever, blue eyes, to make sure it was actually you claiming the pension. So they list that kind of demographic information. And from there, we can actually get a sense of many of these black musicians. They're often mentioned in memoirs. And there are a few where you can construct their life stories pretty well. There are a number who were brought to Britain as servants, gentlemen's servants, and then kind of like their second career then became working in a military band. There were a few who were escaped slaves. There's very often some of the raids on the American coast during the War of 1812. You see, a couple days later, there's a black man named sort of Caesar who suddenly joins the regiment, and years later we see he's a bass drummer, and the clear implication there is he was kind of liberated, and then either volunteered or somewhat against his will was saying, well, here you're now the bass drummer. We've got a lot of prisoners of war who were black sailors who were in the French fleet. Or French merchantmen are captured, and regiments pretty systematically go to these prison camps, and they're looking for black men to sort of fill out this kind of like Turkish or Ottoman template that they want to fill, and they're competing with all the other regiments. So they just go and say, do you have any tall black men who are prisoners here or who are willing to volunteer for musical service? So we actually get a good sense of where they come, where at least some of them come from. We know a lot of sailors, as I said, and some escaped slaves. There's one letter written in 1822, which is kind of printed in another book. it's not, you sort of always wonder, like printed in a book in the 1830s, you wonder, is it real? But actually the person that they're referring to, we can find the pension record. So it does seem to line up, where he's an escaped slave writing back to his family in Antigua, I think. Talking about his life in London. He's like, oh, I'm a tambourinist in the Coldstream Guards. I've got like gold and tassels all over me. You won't believe how expensive oranges are in this country. Whereas we have them all over the place. And it's quite an interesting, poignant letter where he actually seems to be enjoying himself quite a bit and talking about his family and children. That glimpses like that. Unfortunately, we only have a few, but John's done some amazing work trying to trace down these genealogies, being in contact with descendants. And I keep telling him he needs to publish his book, and I'm sure he will one day, but he's saying there's always more. And I'm saying, John, you got to publish something, because it's a great, very topical thing that people are interested in. And, you need to put your mountain of work on record so everyone else can benefit.
Yeah, he should.
Yeah.
Rohan's asked, did musicians receive formal training in the army?
Yes. The nature of the military training was to a large extent based on up to the regiments, but there were certain efforts to make it more formal. So at the very end of the period, 1815, 16, there are these manuals with a kind of step-by-step guide to how to play the drum. We're saying, you hold the sticks like this, then you practice the first rudiments, then the next ones. Something similar, slightly less detail for the fife, and also kind of music theory books, where this was actually meant to be put in the regimental schools. So that the boys would be copying down the music onto their slates, and they'd follow the lessons, they'd learn a bit of music theory. It's kind of difficult to know how far each regiment was actually implementing this. There's certainly some evidence that drummers weren't musically literate later on, but there's a clear effort to kind of standardize and ensure that musical literacy, in that case, with the bugle calls and trumpet sounds, are also formalized. There's been a view that basically because there isn't a kind of manual, like a music manual for the band instruments and et cetera, because it's all down to each regiment, that like basically this was unsystematic, haphazard. The bandmasters could be drinking a lot and not paying attention. That was certainly an issue. There were finding good instructors in a time where there was a huge, there was a seller's market for musical labor was a real challenge. Finding good instructors, they were in hot demand. That said, the army had the military had a very systematic approach, and I think rather than saying it was kind of haphazard and didn't really have any kind of coherent message, the army is actually very interested in some core things, which I think are very much tuned to what you can say makes a good ensemble. A lot of practice time. So that's, easy enough in the regular army and the militia, where, it's a full-time professional outfit. You're practicing 6 days a week at least, often several times a day in the band, but also the fifers and drummers. And there's plenty of evidence that this routine is followed, even on campaign, where, officers are saying, I can't barely write this letter because the buglers are practicing in the orange grove outside and the band is playing next door. So I'm going to just have to give up. And this is like in Portugal and cantonments. So, they're still going strong. So lots of practice time. Even the volunteers that are basically meet at the weekends or in evenings, they're still saying we need to practice every week, guys. So there's a kind of effort to have regularity. Discipline is very important. So the very hierarchical system of listening to the bandmaster, drum major, he's in charge, he tells you what to do. Musical literacy is very important. So for most instruments, the band, all the band instruments, the fifes as well, the trumpets, there's a huge amount of evidence that in contrast to some of the rest of kind of musical culture where it's a little bit more, you don't necessarily need to read the notes. The army is very keen on both, because first you need to fix the bugle calls and trumpet calls so everyone plays the same thing, and it's quite helpful for a band that we're all playing from the same. So there's a huge amount of written music, which in manuscript, which shows that you're not writing it out if no one can read it. There's a huge emphasis on ensuring that as one colonel says, that like you need to teach the boys to read music and also copy it out. That's one of the key skills. So you need to teach that to them early. And then finally, having talked about discipline, practice time, musical literacy, there's an emphasis on performance precision, on getting all the notes right in the right order, but also tempo. Tempo is very important because you don't want to mislead the soldiers on the march. The army starts practicing with this plummet device, basically a primitive metronome, where the length of the string it varies, but you tie it to the musket ball at the end, and then basically it's either your ordinary time with the shorter string, or longer for ordinary, and shorter for quick step. And those are standardized lengths of string. And the idea is the band should be practicing, the fifers should be practicing with that all the time, so that they can quickly they don't disrupt the march when they start playing So there's a clear emphasis on kind of core, I'd say core aims. And you can see this even though most regiments are doing it themselves. This is I think there's some clear objectives that regiments are very interested in. They're very obsessed with finding the best musicians and instructors that they can, even though it's often difficult. They'll pay over the odds because they know how important a good teacher is. There's even some interesting in Ireland, the yeomanry. The sergeants, they sort of bring them, the sergeants and drummers, they start bringing them into a local garrison town to basically be taught the drill and taught drums and bugle signals under the supervision of a regular or a militia drum major, because there's a concern that they're not being sort of taught well enough. It starts out with the sergeants, and they say, let's do it with the drummers too, and it's a quite basic program. But on the other hand, in a system where there's no music training colleges, basically, if you want to be a civilian musician, you get apprenticed to another musician who might treat you well, might treat you not well, and that's how it's done. You get apprenticed to a musician. There are no musical colleges at the time. This is an army that with the yeomanry in Ireland. That's a sort of it doesn't get extended, but it's interesting how the government is paying for you to go to a 30-day crash course at the local garrison town, and you get your paper, you get a certificate that has to be signed off. So it's basically an educational qualification system at the end of the month that you can play the qualified drum and bugle beats and sounds. And when you go back to your next inspection, you won't get paid if you don't have that certification scheme. So it's something where the military is actually kind of ahead of the civilian music industry in actually instituting curricula and educational certification in some places and instruments at a time when that actually, plenty of civilian musicians are like, we need a music college, but they haven't actually created one yet.
Yeah.
So I think the Army overall,
I don't know when they created it, but Nella Hall, which was the college, was set up to train bandmasters as well as musicians. So
in the 1850s, and that's really important. But one of the things I try to show is it didn't all start in 1850s where the Army gets serious. Actually, earlier on, the training regime is pretty cogent. It's pretty effective, based on shared principles, and generally works for what the Army wants it to do, which is training a huge amount of musicians and drummers effectively in a sort of shared repertoire.
Okay. Fifes and bands of music in the various settings.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think hopefully the internet's not, you're slightly breaking up there, but Gary I'm seeing the question on my screen, so I'll start answering. So drums and the way the orders and some of the memoirs sort of describe it is, I think we're kind of losing our host here, but the way it describe it is that there's on the march there's meant to be an alternation. I think we've just lost you, but we're back hopefully in action. I was mentioning how the drummer, the fifers and musicians are meant to practice with the plummet to ensure that their time is precise. Well, part of that is saying so that when the fifers and drummers and bandsmen basically play alternately on the march, they sort of keep the same time so that they can transition back and forth smoothly. So on the march, bands, drummers, they didn't play all the time. It was meant to be very clear that soldiers could keep pace without music, without kind of false aids like musical accompaniment. They should be able to know the time regardless. But music would still be used for ceremony. It would still be played intermittently on the march. And what would happen is, there'd be an alternation. So they wouldn't play at the same time. You'd have the fifes and drums play one tune or several tunes, then you'd have the band, and then you have the fifes and drums, and then the band. And so there seems to be generally an alternation. That said, there are also times where the fifes are playing at the same time with the band. And there's a great reference in a kind of contemporary encyclopedia where they describe how fifers have fifes of several different pitches. The C1, which is the C fife, which is what they use for the normal kind of duty calls, but they play the B flat ones with the clarinet so that they're at the right pitch. So there's a sense that they're actually meant to be playing sometimes the fifers with the bands. And there are times like with God Save the King or the Presentation of the Colors where you'd have the drummers rolling whilst the band is playing. So there actually was a lot of cooperation and often alternately, but sometimes playing together. And you see that as well in the personnel where even though they're technically separate units, the band and the drums and fifes, there's a lot of kind of crossover where people will be seconded from one to the other, or a drummer will join the band, or the bandmaster will teach the fifes, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of overlap.
Great. Right. Last question, Eamonn.
Yeah.
And it's from Magnus. And who's publishing your book?
Thanks for the question. I do have someone now, which is good. So we had to shop around a bit, trying to find, an academic press, because I've been told, university presses are seen as important if you want to apply for jobs as a lecturer. But on the other hand, I don't want to be in a position where the book's sort of stupidly expensive as well, or at least that there's a paperback. I want to ensure that there's an affordable version out there, because the university presses can be, they can sort of see the books as very niche, which they often are, and mark and price it accordingly. So Oxford University Press has expressed interest, and there's going to be a peer review process. So I have to send the full manuscript, and it'll be kind of critiqued and constructively so, I'm sure, by various experts. And so it'll be a while yet before I'm sure that comes back. But all being well, if the reports are well, I think Oxford University Press will publish it. I think they've had some good successes lately with some books. Like the Luke Reynolds Waterloo sort of memory one, which I think has done very well for them. So they see this as kind of, it's like history, military history. So, there's a kind of non-academic audience here too, but it might sell to the, music historians as well as the military ones. So I'm sure the hardback will be expensive, but I've been told that there's a paperback, which will be, sort of much more sort of ordinary price, and that should get out. So I think that's a good balance between kind of the prestige of getting a university press, which is seen as very important for academic careers, and ensuring that there's a marketable book out there. So it'll be probably a year or two before it's out, but all being well, I think they'll take it on.
Great, Eamonn, I wish you all the luck for that. Boy, here is a man who is enthusiastic about his subject. Great,
guilty as charged.
Great talk, fantastic answers to the questions. Once again, people are coming into the chat box saying how much they've enjoyed it.
That's wonderful.
I am going to draw stumps, because it is an hour and a half since we started. But I'm certain that wherever you meet members of the society, you can elaborate more on what is a fascinating subject. And as a musician myself, I really, really did enjoy it. So, Eamonn, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you, everyone who's attended. Just a reminder that when you leave the session tonight, there will be a sign-up registration page for Dr. Glenn Price's talk on logistics and supply in the British Civil Wars, which is the November talk. But until then, once again, thanks to our speaker this evening, Eamonn O'Keeffe, and I look forward to seeing you all again at the next one. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.